Now today we're gonna be looking at 5 different ways of roasting coffee at home, starting from $0 and going all the way up to about $4,000. We're gonna be looking at the differences between each way of roasting coffee, sort of what you get for your money and what it means for your end result. And at the end, we'll try to evaluate whether or not each of these roasters is really worth their cost. One quick note is if you do try any of these methods at home for yourself, make sure that you have a decent amount of ventilation because it can get a little bit smoky. So I'd recommend running like your overhead stove fan or just opening a bunch of windows. And our first method is actually entirely free as long as you have a stove and some sort of pot or a pan, preferably one that's not non-stick. The non-stick stuff is toxic, number one, and then number two, it melts at these really high temperatures we're gonna be using for coffee roasting, so you definitely don't wanna drink that. It's not good for you. Now, because I already roast coffee, I have a bunch of green coffee here behind me that we'll be using. We're gonna be using the same coffee for all of these different coffee roasters and comparing them at the end. But if you don't have any green coffee, it's really easy to order online. There's a ton of great websites that will ship directly to your house, and it's really fun to be able to shop around and find some cool coffees that sound fun to roast, so would highly recommend that. Now, pan roasting is actually the oldest and simplest method of roasting coffee, where you literally just take a pan, put it over a heat source, and put green coffee in and roast it until it's nice and brown. But there's a couple of things that will help you along the way if you're trying pan roasting for the first time. The first thing is to preheat the pan. So just like you would preheat an oven before using it, putting that pan or pot on the stove and heating it up until it's pretty warm. If you have a digital thermometer, that's super helpful. For my roast, I'm just using a pitcher thermometer that you'd use for like an espresso machine, but any thermometer really would work fine for this. Now, once our pan is preheated, we can pour our green coffee in and begin stirring. For this first part of the roast, you wanna start with pretty high heat and then slowly taper that heat down as the coffee begins to get darker. Now, what's cool about all of these methods is we can very easily see the different phases of roasting coffee. To sort of oversimplify, there's really 3 phases that we're looking at. The drying phase, which is essentially where we take the coffee that's green, expose it to heat so that it can dry out because there's moisture trapped in those coffee beans or seeds. But you can just think about this as the green phase. The Maillard phase, which is where we have a bunch of complex chemical reactions taking place like caramelization, but to oversimplify, you can think of this as sort of the yellow phase. And lastly, our development phase, which is essentially anything after first crack, which you'll hear the coffee itself crack, sort of like a popcorn kernel will. And this is just moisture escaping the coffee bean itself in the form of water vapor and cracking the coffee bean. This is really where we develop the final flavor of our coffee and what it's gonna taste like and how dark we roast our coffee. But you can just think about this as sort of the brown phase. I would say the biggest downside of roasting like this is number one, your arm is gonna get tired because you have to stir the beans constantly. Because this method heats the coffee only through conduction, meaning it has to have direct contact with the pan to be able to heat the coffee. If you're not stirring the coffee constantly, you'll end up with much darker regions of the coffee, and essentially it'll only roast one side of the bean. A good way to think about this is if you have cold hands and you're trying to warm them up on a cup of coffee, you're only gonna get warm from the parts of your hand that are actually touching the coffee mug. And if you leave your hand on the coffee mug for too long, if it's too hot, then you might burn your hand on that spot. It's the same thing with our coffee beans. We just don't wanna burn them on one side. We wanna make sure that we're trying to distribute that heat as evenly as possible. Now, once we get to first crack, you'll hear that cracking sound or the popping sound, sort of like popcorn. And at that point, we can take our coffee and move it to a cooling phase. Now, you can try to cool it a bunch of different ways, but what I found is rotating it between 2 bowls or strainers. And basically, this just exposes the coffee to air to help kind of flash cool it as much as possible. A couple of downsides to this method is it can be a little bit messy, and you just don't have a ton of control over the heat other than the stove. Okay, next up is our $20 option, which is actually just a popcorn popper. What's cool about popcorn poppers is they're cheap and they work really well for coffee roasting because instead of heating the coffee through conduction, we're actually heating the coffee through convection or moving warm air through that coffee. A good way to think about this is if we go back to our metaphor of trying to warm our hands with our coffee, instead of touching the mug directly, if we put our hands over the top of our mug, all of that warm air from the coffee will heat our hands a little bit more evenly instead of only making the parts that are directly touching the mug warm. And just like our pan method, we're gonna go through the same stages of roasting. Now, what's great about the popcorn popper is it heats our coffee a lot more evenly, but the downside is we don't have any control over our variables like we did with our stove, turning the heat up or down. There's really just an on and off switch for the popcorn popper. And similarly, once our coffee is done, we can pour it out into a bowl or strainer and expose it to air until it's cooled down. Next up, we're gonna be looking at our first dedicated home coffee roaster, which is this simple device, which is basically a custom shaped sort of pan or vessel to put coffee in that we can stove roast with. Some cool features about this coffee roaster is because the opening at the top is much smaller, we should theoretically get some convection heating as we roast our coffee. And we also have a hollowed out handle at the back, which will allow us to pour the coffee out easily once we're done roasting. Downsides to this method are really just the manual process of having to shake and agitate the coffee while you're roasting. It can just get pretty exhausting to do for a long time. If you're doing 1 or 2 roasts, it's probably not a big deal, but if you wanna roast a lot of coffee, this is definitely gonna be a workout for sure. One thing I definitely recommend with this method is holding it with an oven mitt, just because it gets pretty hot, especially if you're roasting for a long period of time, and having to shake constantly means your hand always has to be on that coffee roaster. Let's take a look at our next roaster, which is the Fresh Roast. This is a very popular home roaster because you get a lot more control of your variables. This is also a great one because you're really able to see clearly what's happening to your coffee during the roast. This would definitely be my recommendation for anyone who is serious about wanting to learn how to roast coffee, mainly because you have control over those individual variables that are going to translate well if you want to upgrade into a larger roaster in the future. One thing you won't have access to at this price point though is fancy bells and whistles like roast curves and setting automatic roast profiles so that you can roast the same coffee the exact same way every time. Which brings us to our last coffee roaster, which is our most expensive by a long shot, the Aleo Bullet. This is my personal roaster and I've had it for several years at this point and absolutely love it. What's great about this price point is you're able to roast a lot more coffee than we would from any of our other roasters we've looked at so far. You also get access to things like roast curves, custom roast profiles, which allows you to roast the same coffee the same way every single time. A lot more control over variables like heat, airflow, and the speed of the spinning drum inside the roaster. You also get a cooling tray, which really helps cool down the coffee immediately after it's finished roasting, which is an issue I found with some of these other ways of roasting. You almost have to roast lighter than you think because it'll continue to roast after you've pulled it off of the heat source because it's really hard to cool it down fast enough. All right, now that we have all of our coffees roasted, let's do a quick taste test to see if more money really equals a better roast. Okay, now that we have our coffees all ready to go, we'll go from the least expensive, the free version, and then our popcorn popper, our stovetop roaster, our fresh roast, and then finally the big boy. To be honest, I'm surprised how good that tastes. It was not a very consistent roast. A lot of very dark beans, so I'm surprised. That's actually pretty solid. Definitely different than the pan roasted one. I feel like I'm getting a little bit more sweetness from this popcorn popper one. It feels like there's a little bit more clarity. You can taste a little bit more. I like that, that's not bad. Ooh, big difference between these two. Much more bitter in this guy here. I'm really tasting, I feel like the roastiness of it, so like the smoke clearly I think is getting trapped in this roaster more than sort of it would be in the popcorn popper, which makes a lot of sense because there's a lot more airflow moving around in this one. I'm definitely tasting some more smoky, bitter notes, which I'm not a big fan of. And yeah, this one, again, getting more of that sweetness from the roast, which I like. A lot more similar, I think, to the popcorn popper. This one, hands down, I think is just the most balanced between all of them. Yeah, definitely the most clarity, the most well-balanced. I feel like the best sort of overall roast from this one here. Okay, so if we're gonna rank them from worst to best roast, I think last place, unfortunately, is the coolest looking one, probably. I think this is still like a good little novelty. Maybe if you go camping, this would be a fun little thing to bring along. Second to last place would be the pan or the pot roast. All here is pot roast, like the meat. You know, honestly surprised how decent that was. I think it's very drinkable, especially if you're just wanting to like try to learn how to roast coffee. This is such a great option, and surprised how not bad it was. Between these two, I think it's pretty close, honestly. The popcorn popper is really solid little roaster, actually. For the jump in price, you get a lot more control with this one, which I would definitely give the advantage to, but you can definitely tell the results of using that convection heating versus conduction. And obviously, first place then goes to our big boy here. Just a lot more balanced, I think, of a roast overall. I feel like it was more consistent sort of flavor. There's still that complexity, which I like. Pleasantly surprised with just about all of these actually. I think this is the only one that was a bit of a letdown, but it still worked pretty well. So what's the verdict? Well, I definitely think that spending more money equals more features and a little bit more control over the roast that you're actually creating. But by no means do you have to have a very fancy, expensive roaster to roast good coffee at home. And that's part of why I wanted to make this video. I think that coffee roasting can be pretty unapproachable for a lot of folks, but realistically, you can roast coffee at home in the pans that you have on your stove and make some really delicious coffee. Sure, you can get really detailed and nerdy and crazy with all kinds of roast curves and metrics with your coffee, but at the end of the day, I think you can roast good coffee on just about anything. So if you've ever wanted to roast coffee, I totally recommend giving it a try. The way that I got started was roasting at home and just trying new coffees and seeing what they tasted like, and I just had a ton of fun exploring and learning about roasting. All right, that's pretty much it from me. I hope you enjoyed the video, I hope you learned something, and I hope you try coffee roasting. And with that, I will see you Monday.